The business with flashbacks, of course, the two games I always talk about for this are Cold Soldier and Showdown. Um,
Hmm.
and so the interplay between flashbacks and the mechanics of the games are very stark, but they are remarkably open for content. Two games of
Right.
Showdown that had the same numbers appear on each of the the devices of
And
play could be
and
extremely
that's
different
kind of
games. Right,
and that's kind of my intention here is that
right,
the most open play is the flashback scenes.
right,
Like the little room scenes are just like
right,
little monster encounters, right? But
hmm
the story, for lack of a
right.
better word, is in the flashbacks. Like
Which is why
it
my
could be
final
about
thing,
anything.
yeah, which is why
Yeah.
my final example is from
Hmm.
a game that saw some consulting at its play, and you can go back in the consulting session to find it. Was Robbie Barrett's Waiting Room,
Okay.
which
I already like the
is
title.
actually sounds a little okay. There are aesthetic drivers involved
Hmm.
there, which are quite similar. It's a little more explicit in terms of, you know, you're probably dead, and now we're
Right.
going to find out like where you're going to go. And not only
Right.
that, but it also has a lot to do with what kind of a moral universe are we in anyway.
Mm.
And
Okay.
so it's in which, I mean, you can even come up with a situation where, you know, judgment after death and your destination doesn't matter. There isn't a mind, that cares about this stuff. You could even end up that way. Um, so anyway, Robbie spent a lot of time kind of engineering the game through a lot of classroom play, and
Hmm.
so anyway, these are sort of called out for you to judge their mechanics relative to your own aesthetics, if that
Sure.
makes any sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. No.
Um,
Absolutely.
but it's a design space that seems to be, people have been gravitating into it in different ways.
Hmm.
From the ones I just mentioned to you, two of them are two-player game. One, two, three of them are two-player games. One of them is a solo, and Waiting Room is actually supposed to be for a large group.
Oh,
Right,
really?
right,
Okay. That's even more interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's not a lot of democracy in its systems. There's a whole lot
Yeah.
of like feeding into the resolution mechanic without anybody knowing what anyone else is putting in it. Stuff like that.
Right.
There's a lot of that. Um, but in your case, if we move to kind of the social ecology of the game, it sounds to me as though certainly at least three people should be players, so that different
Hmm.
one-on-ones can happen. And so
Yeah.
a meetup is more profound than just another one-on-one. Um,
Hmm.
and so with three plus, and and it seems kind of it seems relevant at least to think about, okay, now let's talk about the real people in their room or in their gaming context playing the game, and just in raw anthropological terms, how many of them are talking at any one time, and
Hmm.
what is the trade-off between talking groups, and who's in them, and just
Right.
look at the clusters of talking and listening, around the room. I mean, how many people
Right.
are sitting there outside of a talking cluster at any given time? How does that work?
Right.
Um, and so I think a vision of that is starts to look more relevant when you played that game, which featured the scene with the fountain. I mean, how many people were
Hmm.
involved?
I think I want to say I had the setup you're describing. I had one other person volunteer to be the second GM, and then I think I had three people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I just don't remember the other two scenes as well.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because we only played through the full cycle for one of them because it was like an hour long thing.
Right, right.
Um, uh, and So there's a lot of stuff. I mean, do you want me to get into it? Because I have answers for some of this. Like,
Well, to
yeah,
some extent, at the moment you thinking it over and either saying, "Oh my God, I haven't thought about this," or say, "Ah, I got that
yeah,
taped," either is
yeah.
more important.
Sure.
Um,
Got it. Yeah.
there comes then uh, a concern or a thought that has a lot to do with paralysis of scene creation.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that I've been talking about lately is that we
Mm-hmm.
are making the concept of scene, which is to say, okay, where are we right now? And this,
Mm-hmm.
we are making it carry the weight of too much. We are trying to make it carry the weight of actually being responsible for the whole situation that all the
Yeah.
scenes are embedded in and how that's changing.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads to a lot of things. It leads to people spitballing and like spaghetti throwing, right? As far as the larger situation is concerned. Oh, I guess there are aliens and they're gonna come into this or something, right? They kind of
Mm-hmm.
flail around with too much content. Or as you know well, people get trapped in the future and start blithering about what the scene is for,
Yeah.
what's going to happen in it, what's going to be the outcome of this thing that it's my job only to start, and yet here I am talking about what's going to be in it and how it will turn out. This is the problem when
Yeah.
you're playing primetime adventures and it comes to someone's turn to actually start framing a scene, and they start saying, okay, this is the scene where I meet you and then we argue about this,
Yeah.
right? And you're
Yeah.
like, wait, none of that is in your authority to say. None of that.
Right.
You may not talk like that. You can't.
Yeah.
You cannot. It's just you say we're in the cafeteria. That's what you say, right? And shut up about the storyboarding of what's going to happen. So it's actually often necessary, literally, to use those phrases. You can't
Yeah.
say that. That is not in the rules. You may not.
Right.
And so that leads me to look back at the drowning flashback.
Yeah.
Let's think really carefully, or it's not plural. I wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
You need to think, you can think back really carefully, but share with me what the person said actually literally to open things up, to start describing it. And then how did actually playing the scene
Mm-hmm.
take it past the point of how that person framed it? Take it past.
Right.
How did play go further than what was framed?
So the creative intention here is to sort of stack from big to small.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the player who says what room in the building they're going. Then based on some factors, one of the two GMs describes the content of the room.
Right.
So using those two ping pongs, right?
Mm-hmm.
What room, what it looks like. The player then sort of pitches a situation. This reminds me of the time my brother and I were on a lake and he almost drowned.
Right. Now
then, yeah. Then after he pitches that micro situation, right? This is the core thing that this thing was about. Then it's actually the good GM runs the flashbacks. He basically picks it up from there and goes, okay, you're on the lake, your brother is there,
he says
falls
this,
off the boat.
right.
Yeah. Right. So essentially the good GMs the flashbacks.
Well, let's be careful about that.
Yeah.
Who made up the toy? Who was the first person who made up the toy?
I believe it was the player. I believe he said we were fighting over a toy.
Exactly. Do you see how important that is?
No, absolutely.
Because he did. That means the good GM didn't GM that part.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I think he introduced the father coming out and being like seeing the action. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but that's an interesting point. It's time to start thinking about authorities.
Right.
It's time to start thinking about who actually gets to say, okay, we were on a lake. Okay, player, we were on a lake.
Yeah.
Some of the context, which if it's everything, it's the final conclusion, if it is the totality of the scene, then the scene is unplayable. So it can't
Right.
be the totality, right? There has to be things we are uncertain about.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a critical point. The what they're allowed to say is important regarding the scene, right? And what they're not allowed to say is important. And then in the course of doing things in the scene where we are led to believe that the player leaps into the body of the character and can only control their muscle movements, right? And everything else is the gym. We know that's not the case. The player said we were tussling over a toy, and that is not the character's muscle movements, that made the fucking toy. So, and we also know that distinction that I just drew of not being in your character's body and saying what's happening about it is super common. If you talk to people about their role playing, and they will swear that they play only their character, sensing only what the character senses, etc. And then you sit down and play, and the son of a bitch is doing all sorts of toy creation all over the place.
I think you see it most often with like games that don't have explicit tier lists. Like they're really comfortable just saying what they own, right? It's like, oh yeah, I pull out my knife. Oh, I didn't know you had a knife. All right, I guess you have a knife.
That's definitely the case. And then other things too. I mean, we've talked before, and I've talked to people about it since, about if when you pull the candlestick off the mantelpiece to beat the zombie's head in, who put that candle there?
Right.
And so but it happens that's my real point. It happens all the time. So with that in mind, the notion of I'm real interested in the moment to moment to moment play of the flashback scene.
Sure.
And while it may have gone very nicely in that instance, it went very nicely because the people interleaved their contributions in some functional way. And we are often, those of us who have been through 10,000 game sessions with many different people in many different systems, are well aware that one of the things you bring to the table is the willingness to see how the other people are talking and figure out how to talk so that interleaving can occur with what you say and with what they say, and that particular skill is something that very few role-playing games will be honest about. Right. So you have to actually see, well, it has to happen for us to role-play at all. How are they doing it here at this table? Right. How are they doing it here? And then doing it properly, for yourself. And then everybody says, wow, that guy's a really good role player. And you're like, well, no, I actually kind of just know what has to happen in order to play. And I, accommodated that. You didn't see like Ron role play. You saw Ron being a good role player with you. Right. So, so the idea here is, what formalization of such things is necessary? My argument is that
really tricky.
It is, because over-engineering it is unnecessary. But it only occurs properly when certain things are rock solid. And then the rest can be left to interface properly. And that is not something I find that is easily done through strict theoretical engineering. I think it is better to draw upon play you like. Upon play you like and have enjoyed, that you find works really nicely for this. It's the way you want to do it. Right? How would you do it? How would you enjoy being the flashback player? And that what would you not like to have to make up in order to do it? And that, I think, is more the way to go, and just drawing on your own enjoyment, of play for this purpose.
It's so difficult to describe when you're writing it down, right?
Well,
because it's like
true, but let's worry about that some other time. What you're writing down in most cases is pedagogy for someone else.
Right.
And I'm not interested in those people right now. They can all like they're in the future,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
We don't care about
Yeah.
writing for them right now. We're talking just about, how to do it. So therefore, instead of instructions, it's more just like the way you would note it to yourself. So that when
Okay.
you see that phrase, you're like, okay, that's what I mean, right? And who
Right.
cares whether it's phrased in a way that any other person
that makes sense to anybody else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And so because we have we have other problems right now than worrying about how other people misread everything. So so with that in mind, it kind of frees us up, right? We don't have to worry about developing the game. We don't have to worry about articulating it, teaching it, organizing it, whatever. So I'm actually kind of enjoying the liberation from those concerns quite a lot.
Right.
And in fact, I think I should have figured that out a long time ago in terms of helping people with games. First things first, publisher you is future you, and future you is going to have a whole hell of a lot of issues to worry about, and you don't have to worry about any of them.
Yeah.
Right. So with that in mind, yes, I agree. Articulating it is tough, but it's not, you're not under the pressure to do it for anyone but yourself, at least.
Right.
Right. And in some ways, it can also remain a little bit uncertain here and there because, next time you play it, you might find yourself pushing that envelope a little bit. What if I do set up, more about what the canoe? Maybe I'm going to say we're further out in the lake. I mean, what do you mean the dad comes and saves him? Fuck you. He cannot. We're off in the middle, right? Kid's 30 feet down. So, that's sort of But if the GM has that, under their, they say how far the canoe is out on the lake, whether it is feasible for the dad to go rescue the kid, it's not up to debate. We just have to know who gets to say it.
Right.
It can't be who says it first.
Yeah.
Right. That's no good. So, you see what I mean? I mean, there are things that those two players knew what to say or were willing to, I say this far, knowing that the other person can go that far, that nobody knew except for the two of them.
Yeah, I think the real interesting limit there is honestly when the player initially says what the scene is about, how much because he says, we're out on a lake fighting over a toy and my brother almost drowned, right? Like that's the and that's about the right amount of content.
I'd say so, yeah. I agree.
Yeah. So so it's kind of like, we don't want him doing the PTA thing where it's like, oh, we were fighting and I pushed him over and blah, no, we were out on a lake, we were fighting over a toy and he almost drowned. Like, well,
there's all sorts of uncertainties there. Where is the moral culpability of the main character? If they just tussled and there was an accident and he was terrified, that's one thing.
Right.
And the father had to save him. But, there's an accident. They tussled. It could have been him who went over. No, it was the brother who went over. And, there you are and you're terrified. You don't do the right thing because you're too scared. But the father jumps in and saves him. That's one thing.
Yeah.
Note that the player chose not to do that. The player chose to put in more culpability, perhaps due to the character's immaturity, so it's still kind of gray, that, that he didn't. He actually said, no, I have my toy. I'm not. So, and so that's a big deal, right? But we didn't know that going in.
Right.
So there are, Simon, actually the guy who came up with this is named Ricard. He actually lives in the same town I do. And he, he's really big into, story games, basically. And he actually has some really, really good thoughts about it because he talks a lot about the necessary uncertainty of play. And lately I've been making a big deal about the interplay among uncertainty, agency, and constraint. And so those together, I think, are a big deal. I mean, a crucial element of being able to play a scene at all are uncertainties about, and we're talking about in the fiction itself.
Right.
I mean, easy enough. One of the greatest ones in the history of role playing, right? What's behind that door?
Right. Yeah.